Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for your patience. We know that there's folks who've been waiting for a while. We have a shared Zoom account with our Clergy Emergency League team, and one of our members is on another meeting at this time. So it threw us for a bit of a tech loop, but we're so grateful for you showing up and having so much patience with us getting started. I'm the Reverend Lauren Thomas, and I am on the steering committee for the Clergy Emergency League. In a couple of minutes, I'll have the privilege of introducing you to our other Clergy Emergency League steering committee member, the Reverend Pamela Griffith-Pond, who's here with us too, and then introducing our presenters for this evening. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen to share a little bit with you about why we're here tonight and to give us some context for why we're having this conversation. So I will do that. For those just joining us, including I'm seeing some of our presenters coming on, thank you so much for your patience. We'll just go ahead and get started here, and I think we can make up the time as we go through the evening. Well, again, a very warm welcome to everybody joining us wherever you are. We're so glad you're creating the time to be here for this Clergy Emergency League meeting. Our history is that we started in June 2020, and we are a grassroots network of more than 2,600 clergy across the United States, resisting white supremacy, reclaiming theology, and renewing our commitments to justice and liberation for all. We provide support, accountability, resources, and networking for clergy to prophetically minister in their congregation and in the public square as we face a time of political upheaval, social unrest, and partisan division. Oops, sorry about that. You can check out our website, clergyemergencyleague.com, and that's a great place to sign up for our emails. That's where all of these meetings and special events get sent out. And you can also sign up for our Facebook group. For those who are not yet in our Facebook group, we have some admittance questions that we encourage everyone to answer, and that's how we end up preventing bots from infiltrating our Facebook group. So if you have friends who are hanging out in limbo that you've invited into the Facebook group, but you've not seen them in there, or they're wondering why they haven't gotten in, that's probably why. You can encourage them to answer those questions. Pamela will go ahead and put these links in the chat. And then finally, here's a direct link for our email list. We'll share this in the chat also. And then we do have a public-facing Facebook page. So our group is specifically for clergy and for theological educators, but the public-facing Facebook page is for anybody, and a great way to also gain access to all the public-facing events that we hold throughout the year. A brief introduction to the other folks who make up our steering committee. As I said, I'm the Reverend Lauren Thomas. Our co-founders are the Reverend Dr. Leah Shade and Reverend Stephen Fearing. And our other members are Reverend Nelson Rebel, Deacon Kieran Andrews, Reverend Robert Franick, who's with us tonight, and the Reverend Pamela Griffith-Pond, who is co-hosting this event with me tonight. I'll turn it over to Pamela at this time, who will share a little bit about our priorities this year, our emphases, and open us with a prayer.
Let us pray. Gracious God, as you accompanied your people in their journey through the desert long ago, so you continue to accompany us still in every circumstance, every uncertainty, every struggle, and every celebration. As we meet today, help us to follow the leading of your Spirit into new and uncomfortable territory, and inspire us for your service in these days of burgeoning Christofascism and threats to personal safety. We pray in the power of your love. Amen.
Amen.
So This year, Clergy Emergency League has identified 5 areas for emphasis on our work together. Reclaim scripture and theology, attend to self-care, counter disinformation, brainwashing, and cult mentality in congregations, sustain ongoing work of dismantling racism, white nationalism, and respond to threats, dangerous situations that impact clergy and congregations. Today's presentation will focus on the last 3 of these.
So tonight we have the opportunity to learn from 4 folks who are doing really tremendous work around preparing people across the country, including congregations, for the midterm elections. And they do incredible work around democracy and preventing political violence and responding to acts of violence. So this session is intended to prepare all of us to be able to help our congregations in this contentious season, knowing that the work goes on long beyond what will happen in November, as it has continued to for the last few years. We're joined this evening by 4 people. Rachel Brown, who's the founder and executive director of Over Zero, an organization that works to build resilience to identity-based violence and other forms of group-targeted harm. We're also joined by Dr. Joel Day, who is research director at the Bridging Divides Initiative. Sandy Ovalle Martinez joins us from Sojourners, where she's the director of campaigns and mobilizing and leads SojoAction, which is the mobilizing arm of Sojourners. And finally, by Lauren W. Reilford, MSW, who develops and implements Sojourners' political strategy, positioning, framing, messaging, and advocacy for outreach and impact on Capitol Hill and the presidential administration. So this time I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, and we'll hear from them for about 45 minutes. And then after they've presented, we'll be opening up the floor to all of you for your questions. And so in the meantime, if you have any questions that occur to you that you want to put in the chat, we encourage you to do so. Myself and Pamela will be vigilant to attend to those questions, gather them up, and then share them in the Q&A. And then also, if you have questions that you'd like to ask by unmuting at that time, then you'll be invited to do so. So I do invite you to hold your questions. There's a lot of wonderful and helpful information that our presenters have to share this evening. So hold on to your questions, jot them down, don't forget them, and we will come back to them at the end of our time together. So at this time, Rachel, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to be on here with a group of committed leaders working to address this set of issues. I can get started for a minute while we wait on the screen sharing, but my role right now is just to provide a little bit of opening definitions and framing for what we're talking about when we start to discuss political violence specifically. And I'll come back on in a minute to talk more about what we can do. So I just wanted to start with a really simple definition, which is that in our work, we define political violence as violence that's aimed at political ends. So this means violence that is aims to control or change who benefits from and participates fully in U.S. political, economic, social, and cultural life. So this is violence that has really clear and specific goals. This definition also includes threats, intimidation, and harassment, because these are uses of the coercive power of violence to, again, change who can participate and benefit from a full life. I want to talk about elections really quickly because we have a lot of talk about election-related violence. And I think this is in large part because elections are flashpoints in a broader system. So we've actually seen a rise of political violence in the US for a long time, starting with a rise in hate crimes, hate violence. But elections function in the international space that works on this, that works on political violence prevention. We know that elections in many ways function as conflict prevention or conflict management tools. They're a way for groups to compete for who holds power and to basically fight in ways that don't turn violent. And what this means is that where there is a broader risk environment for political violence, tensions, and things like that, elections become a very known flashpoint for political violence. And as long as that broader risk environment remains high, elections become a flashpoint. And prevention efforts tend to be targeted around elections, in part because there's a known date, right? We know when it might happen in a way that we might not otherwise be able to predict. But what's really important to remember is even when our focus is on election violence and election violence preventions, the real work of prevention needs to happen between election cycles to tackle the enabling environment, the driving forces. And we know that in any context, election-related violence and political is related to the broader context of political violence, discrimination, marginalization. And in the US, we see very clearly how the types of election violence that unfold here intersect with our long-term unresolved issues around racial inequality and other forms of marginalization and bigotry, as well as other forms of political violence, such as hate and identity-based violence in our very long history. So I really want to say when we start to see violence, when we start to see it in our society, it is not the brake in the engine, it's the check engine light, right? It's not the thing that's causing the problem. It's a symptom that we should be asking ourselves, okay, what's going on under the hood? What's leading us here? And addressing political violence requires understanding not just the act of violence itself, but its causes and also its goals and the impact it has. Because like I said, political violence wants to change who controls and benefits from a full public civic life in the United States in this context. And so if we want to counter the impact of political violence, we need to understand some of its more tactical goals. So I just want to, for broad framing, it's not just about addressing that incident of violence, it's the impact that it has on our system as well. So what are some of the goals and impacts of violence in a big picture way? Often it seeks to chill public participation and democracy, to intimidate, to make it so people don't feel like they have agency and choice, to increase the perceived cost of participation. It can seek to change institutions by intimidating, changing how they do their jobs, replacing key roles. It can be used to justify further violence as protection and revenge. So often you'll see groups try to incite the quote unquote other side to violence so that they can justify revenge or protection violence. It can also be used to create a sense of chaos and threat, to legitimize a consolidation of power by the state and crack down on different groups, oppositions, forms of dissent. We know that the more violence happens, the more it becomes normalized and accepted. So we get these cycles of violence, and it becomes harder for people to speak out against it. And then often extremist groups that are operating at the fringes can use violence to pull themselves into the spotlight, to portray strength, and especially when they can control a narrative that makes it seem like they're being violent in equal parts with some other side, or that they're acting in self-defense. And so for all these goals, when we think about a response, the initial act of violence matters, but so does the narrative and the reaction it creates. And violence often seeks to control and dominate a particular narrative in line with those goals. And I just want to really emphasize, and then I'll hand over to Joel to talk a little bit about some of the more specifics that we see, that what leaders do matter. We know this from work around the world, that when we start to see an escalation of political violence and these early warning signs, whether leaders of all different types, including and especially often faith communities, faith leaders, do really matters to determine whether violence goes unchecked and has this impact on the system, or whether people stand up and take action to prevent it from achieving its goals. So with that, I will pass it off to Joel.
Hey, everybody. My name is Joel Day, and I am the research director at Princeton University's Bridging Divides Initiative. I am excited to share with you a little bit of the on-the-ground context what we're seeing in relation to what Rachel was just talking about. How is political violence playing out on the ground in places where you're ministering to cities and to folks who are experiencing or perhaps participating in acts of political violence. So just a little bit about the Bridging Divides initiative before I jump into the data. What we do is nonpartisan in nature, and we're housed within Princeton University. Our goal is to track and to mitigate political violence here in the United States. Many of the things that Rachel just said about political violence in general are lessons we've learned from around the world in contexts of civil war, post authoritarian transition to democracy. And what we're experiencing, what you're all experiencing, is the fact that political violence is not out there. Political violence is knocking at the door right here in the United States. And I want to explore with you tonight ways in which that is manifesting itself in the run up to the 2022 and 2024 election. In our work at Princeton, what we do is try to get data to folks like you in a way that is accessible, actionable, and rigorous. I hope that through talking about this today, we're able to do all three of those things, and that you feel empowered for the accessibility of the data, data that you can act on, and be confident that the data that we're providing you is rigorous in a social scientific sort of way. We do other things besides these rapid analysis that I'm going to show you, which is sort of that middle tier right there. We do weekly situation reports. So especially if you're in an area where you know that there are actors of concern like militias or white supremacy groups, we do up-to-date tracking of how those groups are acting and interacting with the election coming up. And so you can sign up, you can email me, sign up to be part of those situation reports if that would be helpful to you and your congregation. We are creating one of the largest longitudinal data sets on threats and harassment of elected officials. And we also do like county by county analysis on political violence and risk to democratic disruption. Today, we're going to focus on that middle piece, which is a brief focus on emerging trends and responses to current events. So as an overview, what I'd like to do is tell you first the takeaway themes, what the data is telling us about how political violence is manifesting in our neighborhoods, in our cities. I'm going to talk specifically about 4 different trends. Very briefly, I'm going to cover white supremacy, what we call unlawful paramilitary actors or militias. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories and how I'm sure that some of y'all are really experiencing that in your own congregations. And then how these different groups are mobilizing around the news of the day, what we might call culture war targets. I'll end on hopefully a more optimistic note about some of the resources that we provide from BDI. So here are the top line takeaways of what the data is telling us. That as COVID-19 demonstrations provided a lot of fervor around anti-government activity, that has really transitioned in the last 3 to 6 months to the same actors now targeting other sorts of groups. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of the presentation, but we've really transitioned with the Dobbs decision being in the news, with Pride Month, with the start of school, right? That these actors are far more interested, are very interested in staying in the news cycle in order to recruit and in order to make a big impact. Secondly, what we're finding is that that there's definitely election fraud protests going on, especially around Mar-a-Lago. We saw that uptick more recently, and that there is this overarching narrative around election integrity and Mar-a-Lago, the resurfacing of Q, upcoming elections is making us a little bit concerned about how conspiracy theories are playing into calls to violence. Thirdly, you can see following the Dobbs decision, violence is being, from the top down, directed towards pro-abortion rights demonstration. I'm going to show you the data of where counter protesters have shown up against pro-choice protests in light of the Dobbs decision. And then finally, harassment at the local level is really being driven by the news cycle. So just this week, you're going to be seeing a lot more activity around back to school, school boards, critical race theory. Just yesterday, there was another unfortunate threat to a historically Black college and university. And as January 6th resurfaces at Capitol Hill in the fall, you'll be seeing more targets around that as well, we predict. And so briefly, I'm going to go through a few of these slides and happy to revisit any. I'm going to pace through them at a fairly quick clip, but I'm happy to revisit them if you have any specific questions when we get to Q&A. In terms of white supremacist activity, we use a data set called ACLID, which really looks at all sorts of news events from around the United States in a rigorous sort of way. We've recorded in the last just 3 months alone, 83 events, and these are with more than a few people where known white supremacist actors are doing things. Most of those events take place in California and Massachusetts. These are protests, or more likely counter-protest activities, where, say, a white supremacist group shows up at a pro-abortion rally or pro-choice rally in order to threaten and intimidate. Here is a longitudinal display over the last 8 months, so the year to date. These are the total counts per week where we have seen white supremacist activity from this data set. And so you can see activity at demonstrations there in the blue, but then white supremacists do a lot more than just show up at rallies, right? They do banners, banner drops, they do leafleting. Just last week, for instance, in North Carolina, a small town mayor removed a Confederate memorial, live streamed it, and the next day, a KKK affiliate leafleted the entire town, dropping leaflets in direct response. Now, that wasn't them showing up at the Confederate monument to counter-protest when it was being removed. So it'd be one of those dotted lines, but they're definitely tied together. This is another data set called the Crowd Counting Consortium. So it's less about every event and more around those kind of counter-protest moments or places where white supremacists are gathering in force. And those, of course, have peaks and valleys with a concerning uptick over the course of the summer or like a consistency uptick over the course of the summer. Again, not terribly a huge number of events, but fairly consistent week to week. Here's a few of the actors that we're seeing manifest in those data sets. So week to week, these different groups are the ones that are being active. This would be a good list for you to keep handy in case there's conversations around them in your congregations. The most prevalent white supremacist actors, especially in Florida and in the southern states, the Guam Defense League is fairly active. Of course, the KKK is active in leafleting. I don't have the number there. In the Northeast, Nationalist Social Club, you see what they did there in their title. They are just Nazis. They are very active right now in New England. To give you a couple of examples. Patriot Front, active in almost every state, and there's the number of flyers and recruitment banner drops in the last 3 months was 26. Here is a geographic representation of all of those different events that we see. In states that are colored yellow, there was at least one event. The dots represent a demonstration activity. The darker dots are a larger demonstration activity. The others, the gray dots, are some sort of recruitment event. Just a couple weeks ago, for example, in Kentucky, maybe it wasn't Kentucky. In one of the states that experienced a natural disaster, we had the Patriot Front turning out and providing aid to people affected by a natural disaster. But of course, that was a recruitment event. And those sorts of events we track as well. Transitioning then from white supremacy to unlawful paramilitary activity, what we find is that in the last 8 months, or 2022, we see 180 demonstrations of militias, in addition to 163 other sorts of events. So clash style events or protest style events are different in our data set from recruitment or training. Proud Boys are the most active group here, accounting for 25 of 62 demonstrations. So this, similarly to the last couple slides I showed you, is a longitudinal display of the number of total demonstrations that we've counted. And here's another map. Very similarly to the last one, we find Texas, California, Arizona being extraordinarily tough hotbeds, especially with Proud Boy activity. But there's events everywhere, right? On the right-hand side, we have the topics of mobilization where unlawful paramilitary groups activated. Of course, you can very clearly see the themes are clear. Around reproductive rights, there was an uptick post, what that symbolizes there in June, we get post-Dobbs decision upticks there, and then the falling of COVID-related events around that time as well. Similarly, here's a list of some of the unlawful paramilitary groups that we're looking at. You'll note that they're not all far right. There are a few active leftist organizations like the John Brown Gun Club that mobilize and show up to protect other groups and say there's a group of, this happened a few weeks ago in Massachusetts. John Brown Gun Club showed up at a trans story hour at a bakery and provided a perimeter, an armed perimeter, where the Nationalist Social Club showed up as well. Those are the sorts of really contested hotbed events that are ripe for political violence, unfortunately. So there's demonstrations on the left and training events and recruitment events. Patriot Front, very, very active in terms of like taking people out for hikes. And I'm sorry if you hear my neighbor kid knocking on my door. That's just how it rolls. Let me transition the last 2.5 minutes here to offline activity driven by conspiracy theories. So I'm not necessarily talking about Telegram or Truth Social or anything like that. What I'm focused on is actual on the ground things that have migrated into real life. We had a church in New York a few weeks ago reach out to us because their next door neighbor, evangelical kind of fundamentalist church, was hosting a convening that was very much centered around election denial. What do we do? What should we be looking for in terms of threat analysis? And so that on the ground concern is top of mind for a lot of clergy, and that's what we're going to focus on here. We've recorded at least 25 demonstrations around election fraud and political prisoner narratives in the last few months, especially after Mar-a-Lago. So this is a geographic representation of that. You can clearly see 2000 Mules, which is it's a movie focused on the big lie. That's popping up all over the country and probably coming to a county or near your church. This is one of the biggest red flags that we can see, because it brings in all of those lists of concerning actors that are all those concerning actors that I just mentioned tend to gravitate towards an event like this, or Election Integrity Summit. The prisoner narrative that I was talking about is around the January 6th election incursion and insurrection. Those people are quote unquote political prisoners, and that narrative is really shown off in events like this. If you know of, by the way, one of these screenings or summits coming to a congregation near you or a community near you, please reach out. I'd be happy to have an offline conversation about that. Finally, this is a real concern for social justice oriented congregations and clergy like you all. As COVID-19 has waned, mask mandates and other things have gone away. We have to find new things to mobilize around. And unfortunately, that counter mobilization has really focused in Pride and in the back to school conversation, especially around trans youth and around targeting trans story hours and those sorts of things. Patriot Front, National Social Club are almost solely focused right now on disrupting those sorts of activities. Similarly, there was a few goofballs, knuckleheads, but like really problematic, violent knuckleheads on Telegram, who put together what they call the hard reset. I don't want to push it too much because it didn't get as much traction as I think that they had hoped, but they specifically called out targeting abortion clinics for violent activities as the new form of violence that they are perpetuating. And that was the heads of several different unlawful paramilitary groups that co-wrote that together. And so we see that absolutely manifesting. We see the complete crash of COVID-19 activities over the summer months, and the complete uptick at the same time of reproductive rights counter mobilization, where these are all demonstrations of all reproductive rights, and then that's tracking anti-choice counter mobilization there at the bottom. Similarly, we have demonstrations around LGBT issues, and you can see very clearly the June uptick during Pride months, and the other uptick around anti-LGBTQ counter mobilization, where they're showing up at a Pride rally in full Proud Boys regalia looking for a fight. Just as in the other representations here, this is counter-mobilized pro-choice activity and anti-choice demonstrations. The counter-mobilization in gray is then showing up at somebody else's rally. The dark is a particular demonstration that they planned and organized. The types of organizations that are doing these things are listed on the right. You've got Idaho Liberty Dogs, you've got the Goyim Defense League, you have Arizona Patriots, and many more of these concerning organizations. This is a map of anti-LGBTQ demonstrations and just in the last 3 months. Again, same actors doing the same sorts of targeted strategies. So those are all examples of what I mean when I talk about the culture war stuff. As these organizations mobilize, they are going to be hunting out what is going to put them on people's radars, what is going to provide hooks into people who aren't part of their movement yet. I'm very concerned with back to school and CRT narratives, or anything that relates to kids, what I like to call the kid variable. Anything that relates to traditional family and raising of children tends to be the thing that they have gravitated towards with as recent data shows, because it is a way to bring in more mainstream conservative movements into radicalization. They saw that with a lot of success with COVID-19. Anti-mask or anti-shutdown laws brought them into the mainstream. Where I live in San Diego, Proud Boys and Patriot Front and a number of other organizations were in tandem, 3%ers in tandem with the anti-mask movement, and now they are fairly indistinguishable in terms of the rallies that they host together. We're finding that all across the country. So what can we do? And I think it's appropriate for me to hand this over now to Rachel in just a moment, but we offer briefings like this, especially for those of you who may be at the intersection of many of these different groups. If there is a Mike Lindell rally coming or a Stop the Steal rally coming to your area, and you want a conversation around who are the actors of concern that are perhaps going to be present, how can I educate my community around this very particular instance of potential violence? That's the sort of thing that we're interested in talking with you about. So please reach out. We also have recently launched up on our website a toolkit for several states. We're going to get to 50 states soon, but in your state, there may be a directory of trainings that are available for you and for your leadership or your congregation as a whole to really focus in on how do we do conflict de-escalation? How do we have active bystander training? Those are resources of people doing that work on the ground. Princeton BDI, we don't do that work on the ground in your particular county, but there may be a resource here for your congregation that it would be very helpful. So that is up on the BDI website. It's interactive. You can explore the resources we have there for you. And so with that, I look forward to our full conversation, and I will hand it back over to Rachel for further analysis.
Thanks so much, Joel. And you've reminded me, I should have said also a word about Over Zero. We are an organization similarly to BDI. We are nonpartisan. Our focus is on preventing and building resilience to political and identity-based violence. And we work with organizations. We do trainings, coaching, advising, and have worked for a while in the space with a focus on communication and the way that narratives and stories and public rhetoric lay the groundwork for violence. And I won't talk all about that today. I'm going to dive right into some of what we can do with that communication focus. So for this part of the presentation, I just wanted to start by, I'll drop a link into the chat. We were talking about it in the preparation for this call, a document we actually put together post January 6th on the variety of things that faith leaders can do. And I really will say, and we see this in contexts globally, faith leaders, faith communities can play a really critical role in setting norms, in creating a moral imperative for people to stand up against violence, even when the justification for violence uses narratives like protection and things like that. So I think it's really important when we think about the different types of actions faith leaders can take. This is not comprehensive, but some examples are use your platform, speak publicly, try to set these norms and narratives. By norms, I mean sort of peer pressure, public expectation. Violence often scares people from speaking out and feeling like they can use their voice. So in that immediate moment, you might have the bystander training, but we can think of this public narrative setting and public messaging in advance and then after potential violence as sort of that broader de-escalation of the larger impact that violence has in society. And we know that violence often seeks to make it seem like it's the dominant force. And so having more voices that stand up and say, no, people are engaging peacefully, people are standing up for the values that everyone should feel safe in our community, can go a really long way. Something that I think is important to remember is tapping into your social capital and mobilizing other leaders. That could be other leaders within your congregation, lay leaders. That could be other leaders within your community, including unlikely allies. So a lot of people might pick up a phone call or listen to a faith leader differently than they'll listen to just any other person. That might be a public political representative, a business leader, right? Think about who has sway and leverage in your community and how you can reach out and engage them and seek to convince them to engage and play a role as a leader alongside you. And actually having unlikely allies standing next to each other and drawing a line in the sand around violence can be really, really powerful message in and of itself. think in advance about how to amplify your messages. So this might mean actually contacting media, letting them know that you'd like to be somebody on their list to call if there's ever an incident in your community, because you want to be able to talk about what types of responses the community might be having, right? So think about how you can proactively make sure that when you are setting a narrative and putting your voice out there, it's actually being amplified and helping set the broader narrative. And then obviously as faith leaders, you all have such deep relationships with your congregations and with your congregants. And so there is that sort of one-on-one or group level deeper engagement if you start to see things that are concerning that are rising within your congregation or amongst your congregants, or just if people are needing guidance and support as they navigate these dynamics. So when we talk about preparedness, we always say rapid response starts now. You don't want to be figuring out, this presentation is focused on what do we do in moment of crisis and the aftermath of a potential violent event. And what we know is, yeah, rapid response starts now. It's so important to proactively build relationships with the people that you want to engage and act with. That includes reaching out to communities that might be targeted with violence. That includes reaching out to whoever else you might want to engage and mobilize with or influence in a rapid response moment. That might mean your local mayor. That might mean, again, a local business person. You'll have the map of who matters in your community. We do have some toolkits and resources, which I can put in the chat for mapping that out. Having a rapid response plan, just knowing who's going to be involved in decision making and how you're going to think about it in advance, can help you not make decisions out of adrenaline and be responsive rather than reactive to the situation. And then anything you can do to proactively set a narrative, not necessarily talking about violence. We don't want to make it the main character of our story, but talking about what you stand for as a faith leader, talking about what it means to live into your values, things like that. You're going to be able to return to that in a crisis moment. So I'll put more resources into the chat, but I wanted to go into a few really tactical, just messaging considerations for do's and don'ts if you're in a crisis moment and talking about violence itself. A core guiding principle here is you want to cut through the chaos, right? Violence is creating this sense of what's going on. People are feeling fear, uncertainty. You want to cut through with a message that redefines who gets to tell the story and what that story is, and takes back some of that control and power. So if you think of that as your starting point, we want to ask ourselves every time, what's the intent of this violence? Let me make sure my response doesn't feed what this violence is intending to do. If it's intending to sow chaos, if it's intending to intimidate people, we don't necessarily want to elevate it to a huge platform and do its work for it, right? We might want to engage with the specific communities under threat, make sure people have information and support that they need, and talk about how communities are coming together to ensure their safety rather than about the violence itself. Always engage with any communities that are targeted, not responding sort of on their behalf without engaging them. So whoever is being targeted with violence, like I said, we've seen rising hate violence over time in the faith community. It might be members of a different faith that are being targeted. Make sure, it might these days also be election administrators. Make sure whoever it is that's on the receiving end of violence, your response is in consultation with them. And that gets back to making sure you have this diverse set of relationships in advance. And then verify details. It's great. I mean, you just had this whole presentation from Joel. There's so many resources out there to be getting data and verifying, but you also probably have, if it's in your community, contacts in the community and ways to verify. You want to make sure you're acting on correct information. And then when it comes to the actual messaging, you want to make sure you're respecting those who are impacted, that you're telling their story in a way that aligns with how they want to be talked about or not, and really showing a level of compassion for them. You want to affirm values. In moments of uncertainty, people gravitate to leaders who say, this is who we are, rather than this is who we aren't. So again, shining that light through in these moments of violence to say, this is who we are, these are the values that we're going to act out of, is a really powerful way to reclaim that narrative. You want to be accurate and specific. A lot of times, like I said, violence wants to make itself big. It wants to control the story. So being really clear about what happened, who was involved, any relevant context, any relevant historical context. And that really helps with not letting people get overwhelmed by this sort of big unknown. And I'll talk a little bit in some of the don'ts about how not being specific, it can lead to further misinformation, it can lead to rumors, but it can also lead to people feeling really overwhelmed. You want to create a sense of agency. You want people to feel empowered. You don't want them to feel coward by the violence. So you want to include in your messaging what's being done and calls to action, right? So again, the violence, the perpetrators, you have to recognize the harm that they've done, recognize what's happened, but they're not the main character. The main character is those who are impacted, the community, who we are, what we're doing, what you can do, how you can get involved. So the momentum is towards addressing the violence and the values that we're moving towards. Activate diverse and shared identities. Showing broad public rejection of violence is really important to show that the dominant force is actually against violence. So that comes to speaking out with unlikely allies. You can activate the identity of your local town and community, of a coalition if you have one, things like that. And consider who are your audiences. And they say the messenger matters as much as the message. So do you have messengers that can reach different audiences, different groups, different people? I want to talk quickly about some of the don'ts. One really important don't is speculation, alarmist language, or vague descriptions. So really avoiding inadvertently sharing misinformation. Avoid natural disaster metaphors. This gets to that question of agency. Language like violence erupted makes it seem like it's a natural disaster, an event that's just happening and is out of our control, rather than a strategic choice and a strategic set of actions that is being done. If violence is being done by someone, is being done intentionally and strategically, we can do something about it, right? If it's just erupted, it's this thing that we probably just need to run away from. So even these details of how we talk about violence really matters. And this is why getting clear and specific matters. Avoiding dehumanizing language is really important as well, because when people hear dehumanizing language that talks about people not as full human beings, it actually desensitizes them to further dehumanization. It's important to be specific in our attributions of blame and responsibility, and to be really careful when we use the language of groups, and to really just reserve that if people are acting as an organized group with a mission. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people have questions on why. A really important don't is to talk about violence without talking about what's being done, because then you leave people just with the story of the violence without that momentum and that light towards where are we moving towards. And then it's really important, this is where a lot of the data and information Joel talked about is so important, that a lot of these violent actors use violence to get free PR. Like Joel was saying, they're like, CRT, we're there. We want to get into the news. School's coming back. They're trying to get themselves to look strong and powerful. They're trying to use events and actions as tools of recruitment, and to get people to join. And so it's really important to be thoughtful and careful about how you talk about these groups and avoid giving them a free platform. We have guidance we did for journalists that I'll put in the chat as well, in case it's useful for you to have. And like I said, rapid response starts now, so it's best not to wait, but to start thinking about just your plans and what guidelines you want to put in for yourself on communication around events and who you want to call. Things like a simple phone tree or list of contacts for yourself can be really helpful to have in advance. And I will stop now and pass it on to Lauren, and look forward to engaging with everyone in conversation.
Thanks, Rachel. At this time, I'm going to invite the Sojourners team of Sandy and Lauren to share.
Lauren will go first, yeah.
Oh, yes, I was about to say good morning, but I don't know if you can tell, it's clearly not morning where I am. So if it is morning where you are, may the rest of your day be really good. And if you are looking at bedtime, hopefully within the next hour or so, that your dreams are very sweet and none of this content sticks with you too heavy, I want to recognize that we are talking about things that really evoke a lot of fear. I think especially as a Black American, knowing that my grandmother, essentially, my great-grandmother had a sawed-off shotgun to chase the Klan off of her property. And here we are sitting here talking about how the Klan is activating and there's recruitment events in the guise of giving out food is really intense. And unfortunately, I am here to continue to bring a bit of intensity. So again, my name is Lauren Reilford. I am social worker, and I also serve as political director at Sojourners. And so Sojourners, I guess the best way to describe us is a group of very intentional Christians who look to scripture to understand who we're being called to be in public life. And so that really focuses on our relationships with self, God, and others, and how we're kind of really showing up to show out to create this collective good. And so I do all of that work and translate it into policy and politics. And a big part of what I've really been tracking, particularly as it relates to voting rights and our democracy, is a lot of what's happening on the state's levels. We have had the Voting Rights Act systematically undone through a series of Supreme Court cases. Bronovich is one. And then you have Shelby v. Holder, which is another. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court is continuing its banner record of dismantling our freedoms as we know it. And we'll be hearing two particular court cases that I think are actually just going to be very important in that it's not immediate, like individual political violence, but this is like systemic, like sort of federal or nationalized political violence, and that it is state legislatures actively using their power to disenfranchise millions of people. They're really focusing on voting rights right now, but this certainly could be applicable to a lot of other states and a lot of other issues, and doing it in a way that would dismantle any sorts of checks and balances at the local, state, and national level. And they're doing this through this theory that we call independent state legislature theory. I call it ISL. Other people may also call it states' rights, but it's this notion that state legislatures are independent from state constitutions and state courts, and obviously the federal court system and district court systems. And so whatever law a state legislature passes, that's it. So they're even going so far as to argue that state legislatures will have the power to pass laws, and no state court can overrule them, even if that state law somehow infringes upon the state's constitution, because the state legislature will ultimately be the supreme decision-making body in those places. And so I don't know about you, but that gives me a lot of fear, because that means that right now, for example, states like North Carolina, where there's a huge case that they'll be hearing in December called Moore v. Harper, can, in the way that they're applying this, is create a district map. And their district map can violate rules for people living in rural areas and access to polls for other individuals. And if the state Supreme Court says, hey, this is unconstitutional, what the new North Carolina state legislature is actively arguing in front of the Supreme Court is, but that's fine, because again, we have the authority. So the Constitution and states elections commissions and state Supreme Courts, you guys just kind of have to eat whatever we do. That means that people have absolutely no redress whatsoever if your state constitutional rights are violated. There's a good chance that if your state constitutional rights are being violated, then your federal constitutional rights are also being violated, right? And who's to say that the precedent set with ensuring that state legislatures no longer have sort of this impetus for investigation, if you will, vis-a-vis state courts and the state's constitution, that they're then going to also say, well, then federal courts and district courts and regional courts also have no jurisdiction over what we say, because ultimately what the state wants, the state gets, and the state has a right to do that. I think from a theological framework, this is particularly terrifying because yes, actually, let me break it down like a parent, and because I think some folks can relate to this. I don't have kids, but as a social worker, I think I know enough about their psyche to understand how they can get down with things. But really, you think about the states are essentially your kid, and your kid has chosen their outfit for the day, and it's 50 below, but they want to go out with shorts and a bathing suit top. and you as the parent are like, hey, I'm the sensible one in the room, I'm going to overrule this decision because it's 50 below and you need some clothes on your body. ISL theory is the states, your kid being able to say, actually, you don't get to tell me what to do. I'm going out in the cold with this bikini top and these shorts, and you just kind of have to eat it. Hopefully, when I break it down like that, in terms of basically a kid telling a parent, like, yeah, you don't get to tell me what to do, I'm going to do whatever I want. I hope that gives you the same kind of fear, or at least I broke it down in a way to understand the fundamental threat to democracy this poses, in part because we're essentially relitigating the Federalist and anti-Federalist arguments that we had in 1787 when we were coming up with the Constitution. So this argument really is about the fundamental foundations of our democracy, the relationship between states, local and national governments, and also the relationship even between state entities. The two big activation points that I'm looking at are going to be in October, where there is a court case that the Supreme Court will be looking at, and it's called Merrill v. Milligan, and that looks at an Alabama case. And that's actually just a really sort of straightforward issue, but it does get into independent state legislature theory, and that the state is trying to say that a map that they drew is not essentially racist against Black residents in Alabama. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Alabama, but there are a sizable still number of Black and brown individuals that live in the rural South. And so to only have one district in all of Alabama that represents Black and brown individuals it doesn't make any sense. And there's the way in which they use census data is unconstitutional, is inherently systematically racist, and is disenfranchising millions of Black and brown voters in the state of Alabama. The state is going to the Supreme Court and arguing that they have every right to do this, in part because Section 2 of the Voting Rights Amendment has almost completely been dismantled through previous court cases. But this December court case, Moore v. Harper, is kind of the big kahuna, because that's really where independent state legislature theory is going to be litigated. And if the court decides that they are going to side with North Carolina, that's going to have an immediate watershed impact on voting and elections laws in all states, because a lot of states who have already had their new maps ruled unconstitutional are going to be able to go back and say, well, this entity rules it unconstitutional, but it's still considered legal by the state legislature. So we're going to go back to disenfranchising, again, millions of voters, not during the midterms, but certainly during 2024. So I feel like I dropped a lot of scary all in one place. I really hope that some of that scary at least made sense. I know that my brilliant, amazing colleague, Sandy Ovalle Martinez, is about to speak. But I would say that in this particular case, at least from a national policy perspective, I am going to go and pull up my some of my Boston College roots and say all politics is local. And so this is really from a congregation perspective, and Sandy's going to get more into this. You can do a lot of the work, one, to just demystify some of the conversation around states' rights. I don't know if folks are just having normal convos to each other where they're like, how about those states' rights? That sounds really great. But I think just getting folks to sort of understand that this is what your state's governments are doing is really important. I think it's also just making sure that you have a command of understanding this, because you may or may not also be voting for individuals this upcoming November who support this very theory. So I would say maybe perhaps before the midterms, really encourage the people that are in your congregations to look and really understand what these individuals care about. I would also note that some individuals who are also proponents of ISL theory in other states are members of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. We've seen in the Miami, or there's certain Florida Republican Party groups who are actively run by Oath Keepers and or Proud Boys and or have them on the ballot. So yes, you may be seeing this as like, oh, this is just the state's issue, it's not going to impact me, it's just about voting rights. One, any avenue for redress is going to have to come through Congress. And so if you in 2022 have a slate of individuals who are pro ISL theory and they get locked in, loaded, then you are not going to have much time between now and 2024 to ensure that our state constitution, your right to vote, is protected against the essential whims of a state legislature who, if you are blue in a red state, you already know how hard it is. Can you then imagine how much harder it is going to be to actually have your voice and your lived experience represented at a state level? And we know that state governments, or at least the way that I operate, what happens at the states really influences what the federal government supports. And so it's really taking this like very I'm trying to think of the word implemental, but it's not what I'm thinking about. Just a really slow process to, again, the eventual just collapse of the federal government. And so to the extent to which you can just engage with folks, get them to really become educated about who they're voting for. Don't just think about one issue, but what do they say about democracy? What do they say about states' rights? What do they say about the role of federal government? Because I think that you'll also see a lot of these folks are parroting a lot of the things that Joel and Rachel said that you find in groups, again, like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. They have a lot of the similar rhetoric. So anywhere in which you can notice that and notice these proponents of ISL also speaking the same thing is a great way to know that you probably shouldn't check that box in 2022 or 2024, because that person is only going to continue to dismantle our democracy, especially once they get more power by becoming a member of Congress, and God forbid, a president. So I'm going to button it up. I'm going to let Sandy speak, but I really hope if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or put them in the chat. And I hope that was somewhat enlightening. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Lauren. It's always so enlightening. And it's been such a great evening of hearing how political violence plays out in our communities and systemically as well, through our political processes, and how this ideologies that threaten the lives of individuals, particularly Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled individuals, LGBTQIA communities, are really at risk. And so my name is Sandy Ovalle. I am the Campaigns and Mobilizing Director at Sojourners, and I have the pleasure of closing us here. And so as I think of all that has been shared, I think that it is even more crucial in this election season to ensure that everyone that is eligible to vote actually makes it to the polls, is registered to vote and makes it to the polls. And so congregations have a big role to play in all of this. Congregations can really not just target their own attendees, but also work with their communities to ensure that those that are most disenfranchised and those who are literally being kept away from the polls have a say in the decisions that will impact their lives. So share a little bit of toolkit that we have with you. I think I can present, and that will make it. I think you may be able to see, but I think we often talk about voter turnout and we often talk about election protections. But in light of all that is happening, in light of the dismantling that is being sought to do against our democracy, this particular election is key. With every seat in the House being up for election, we really have to be cognizant of who is running, what sort of ideas do they have with them and are bringing in. So some of the things that congregations can do as we prepare for elections is that they can preach messages on justice and righteousness. People in congregations can also educate. Lauren, Rachel gave us really good tools on what are the things that we can educate around, specifically the states' right, specifically how political violence gets carried out. Also, we can make sure that members in your congregations know their basic voting facts and voting rights. I am an immigrant. I just became a US citizen. This is the first time I will get to vote in an election in the United States. So I know that there are a lot of ways in which immigrant communities and other communities have been disenfranchised in the past are being targeted and do not know all the rights that they have to show up at the polls and to exercise their right to have their voices be heard. So understand what your house of worship can legally do in elections. We'll go into that in a little bit. Register, make sure your congregation is fully registered. I want to make sure that we also are in the lookout for who in our congregation would have the hardest time registering at this point. So I had an accident this summer, and I now doing very easy tasks like going to the restroom or getting out of my house. They take a lot longer. So I want you to think of individuals in your congregation that may be disabled. I want you to think of individuals that may not have language access. I want you to think of other folks in your congregation, elderly folks who are registering for the first time, newly sworn in American citizens, returning individuals to the community, all of them. What are the barriers that are keeping them from registering? Sometimes it's as easy as I can't get out to put something on the mail. So even if I wanted to have my voice said, I don't, like literally today, if I thought to myself, if I had an emergency, like I can't get myself out of the house, so things like that, where it's like individuals are living through these very real situations that keep them away from a system that is supposed to represent them. You can pray, gather your prayer teams to pray for free, fair, safe elections. Gather your team to pray for the ability of our country to honor the image of God in every single individual, but allowing and respecting the sacred right to vote of every individual. Conduct social media campaigns encouraging voter turnout. Encourage your younger members to vote. We are currently hosting a campaign called Let Justice Roll. And in that campaign, we are having individuals, and we want to invite you to be part of that, share why do you vote? Why are you making this effort? Why is this important? And this may be a very good opportunity for folks to educate on why you are voting in this particular season to honor our democracy, to honor, and sometimes the word democracy feels like so ethereal. It feels so far away. It feels like, why are we talking about democracy? But one of the phrases that we'd like to use is to have the ability to influence the decisions that impact our lives. That's really what democracy is. So conduct different social media spaces where you can do that. Host a turnout Sunday service, and there's a little bit more details on this toolkit that I'll leave with you on that. Plan to organize volunteers to transport and assist the elderly, disabled members to voting sites. Working families that maybe it may be hard to care for the kids while they vote. Do you have a plan? Have you thought about how they may care for their kids while folks go out to vote? Post the polling site and location changes up to the election day. With all of these efforts to disenfranchise voters that we're seeing all over the nation, polling sites are changing on the daily in different spaces. So make sure that you know what are the polling locations and that people know where they are, how to get them. Sometimes, those extra 20 minutes to go to the other side of town really change up a person's ability to exercise their right. And gather with other faith leaders to visit polling sites of your members. So watch what is happening. We've talked a lot about, Joel brought up the de-escalation trainings and addressing violence in polling places. So one of the things that you could do as a clergy person is to have a plan to go with other clergy members and be available in the polling sites to monitor what has happened, to offer a hand. We have a program called poll chaplaincy that you're able to sign up in any of the 9 states where we work, and you can actually be a part of a team. You may not be in one of those states, but you are also welcome to show up in your religious garb, particularly clergy. Your presence in those spaces matters. It has the ability to bring a different side, a more human side, to a place that is highly political and politicized. So here are some things that your house of worship can do, and some things that you can't do during this election season. Do publish news stories about campaigns. The congregation must be kept informed as best as possible. Also, discuss candidates' positions on issues with congregations. And in particular, I would say in this side, discuss what they think about states' rights. What do they feel like? Are they supportive of the kid going against the parent? Or are they someone that sees that we're all linked together and that we really need to work for building a community where everyone's voice is heard? Rent out the faith organizations' facilities for political activities. Provide rentals of membership lists at regular rates. You can allow candidates to make appearances at the organization's events and services. You can distribute candidate campaign literature as an individual faith leader. You can distribute candidate surveys or voting records of office holders. You can publish political ads as long as the regular rates are applied. You can use the organization's vehicle to transport people to vote. You can lobby and campaign for or against legislation as a congregation or individual. Keyword legislation there. Do not support or oppose candidates on the congregation's behalf. Do not use the congregation's funding to give financial contributions of any kind to the candidates or office holders. Do not impose your opinions on the congregation. Do not publish faith organization editorials that support or oppose candidates. Do not publish political ads as a donation. Do not display candidates' literature on organization's vehicle used to transport people to vote. And do not distribute candidate campaign literature as a congregation. So this is a toolkit that we have as part of our Faiths United to Save Democracy campaign, which is in its third phase. This third phase, it's really all about registration and voter registration and getting people to have access to the polls. In late September and over, we are going to shift into a phase of actually poll chaplaincy. So I want to leave with you a space where you can sign up to be a poll, well, first where you can access this this toolkit that I just showed you that has a lot more components in here regarding what voting rights are for specific people. It has ID requirements for different states, etc. So download this kit so you can have a little bit more of what your congregation can do. Next up, if you want to sign up to be a part of the poll chaplaincy ministry, you can do these at turnoutsunday.com, and just in that first banner that is there, you sign up there to do that. I would encourage you attend, if you're not in one of these states, perhaps you may consider attending one of these trainings just to learn the escalation tactics and learn what our clergy are doing in those states. We have an active hotline that is going on during election season. As Rachel pointed out, those days can be particularly violent. And so we have an active hotline where you can call and report that. And that is very significant data that helps us track how our work, how our different groups working. So I will leave that there. And lastly, I do want to say that you are pastoring congregations with individuals that have different opinions that have been shaped by whole ideologies, by families and communities before they came to you. And you're trying to build this community together, and your work is really integral in that space. As we see deeper and deeper polarization in our communities, we want to also help equip you to how do you pastor politically divided congregations. So we've created a curriculum around politically divided congregations to help address just that. It's a small group curriculum that you're welcome to access here. I'm going to leave that that link for you so that you can get to hear it. And I know that later on we may have an opportunity for us to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the politically divided congregations. So I'm going to pause there because I know that there are questions in here, and want to leave some space for that.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Joel. And for all those who are here and for all those who are going to be watching this recording, we're so grateful for the expertise of these 4 individuals. We appreciate you. We consider you to be partners in this work, and we're so grateful that we have you to lean on for the kind of expertise that you provide. So thank you for your good work. We have just about 5 minutes, and so I want to first of all, let everybody know that those resources that were shared just down in the chat will go out with the recording. So this will be shared with our whole network of clergy, both the recording and the resources. And we do hope to be able to have all 4 of you back in some capacity if you're so willing down the road. So thank you again for your time. But I'll kick us off with a question, and then we may have time for 1 or 2 more. I was thinking about the Supreme Court decisions of late and the kind of helplessness that has left so many of us feeling. And it was mentioned that in the aftermath of these kind of events, that they can often be recruitment events, as there are protests. And so I'm curious about what are the kind of productive responses to court decisions that you're seeing happening? I think legislatively that often clergy feel like they have more of a toolkit, but with these court decisions and how much power the Supreme Court in particular has at this point, it can leave a lot of folks, clergy included, feeling pretty helpless. So would love to hear your thoughts about what are you seeing that's been helpful and empowering.
I know I'm trying to think. This sounds so blasé, but really muckraking and making noise and educating really has been, I think, the most powerful, most effective tool, because at least it puts, you have to understand that there's some folks that are very dedicated and determined to shifting or molding this country into one way. But then there's also other individuals that are in some of these spaces that do still have a heart, right? And I am a person of faith, so I don't say like people are beyond reach. You're just beyond my reach, and God is going to handle you. But that doesn't mean that you don't continue to bang your drum. You don't continue to write letters to the editor. You don't continue to get engaged on the state level. I think we really rely on the federal government for a lot of things, and that's clearly true. But again, all politics is local. And so I think to the extent to where you may feel politically or civically spayed or neutered in a way, look to see what's going on in your communities, in the government, because again, a lot of these attacks, if you will, this sort of systematic political violence is happening because they've already done the work at the states and local levels to lay the groundwork to then push this up to the national level. Things don't get kicked up on a national level unless enough stink has been made at the state and local level. So again, to the extent to which you can really carefully look at not just and it's a little too late to do this now, but even in primary elections, go to vote in your primaries. Voting in your primaries is so much more important than actually voting in your general, because the primary determines who's on the ballot in November. And so if you don't even want to have to deal with a really bad Sophie's choice in November, then get engaged in April and May and June and July and August, or whenever your state is already doing that, because you still have power. It's just a matter of finding ways to navigate what power you have, tending that, allowing yourself to rest. But again, I think to the extent at which people can really do advocacy at the state level and really raise awareness and let folks know you're not just going to kick me around and then have your way enshrined as, what's going to happen via Supreme Court arrangement. Again, these cases around abortion, voting rights, affirmative action, paid family leave, $15 minimum wage, legalization, all of these issues are being negotiated or legislated at a state level, and then the Fed gov just puts a stamp on it. So yeah, all politics is local. Tip O'Neill was prophetic. Maybe not the best person in the world, but at least he had some really good things to say.
Thanks,
That
Lynn.
maybe just to add something to that, and from a slightly different angle as well, is to remember that so I'm going to take us on a side path and then bring us back. We know that when it comes to human behavior, and this includes in conflict, one of the best predictors of how we will act is what we think all or most of our peers are doing. So if you think about kids in a middle school cafeteria and what they choose to wear and what bands they say they like and who they say they have a crush on, even like all the way to that, it's what do they think their peers are doing or like or approve or disapprove of. And it's not what their parents are doing or the teachers are doing or the kids at that other lunch table. It's their group, their closest peer group that they care to fit into. And we are wired for it. We're literally wired. Our brains are wired for belonging and to be so sensitive. And it turns out that this is not only true at the kids' cafeteria table, this is true for all of us, and it's a trend throughout life. This is why violence matters so much. This is why it matters so much when people go silent in the face of violence, in the face of dangerous and harmful rhetoric, and even in the face of decisions. And so even if there's a legal decision that's not going to be able to be changed or that's really harmful in some way, those social norms and social pressures still matter. And when it comes to the sort of actors who are trying to do as much as they can get away with, one of the most important things for isolating the very extremist groups and not enabling the mainstreaming is to make sure that other people don't feel like it's okay and they can get away with going along with it. So I would say that setting moral imperatives, especially in a position as faith leaders, like there are laws, there are social norms, and there are moral norms, right? Like there are what are our morals, what are our values? And so when you think about the harms that might be done by something that's been passed, how do you want to call people to act? How do you want to call them to engage? How do you want to create as broad a consensus as possible, a social consensus that says, even if you're allowed to do this harmful thing, it's not okay to do this harmful thing. We're not going to do it. It's going to be frowned upon. And so I would say just to remember that as much as those elements matter, it's not the only thing that influences what will happen, and to try and really also find ways to exert that moral authority, those moral imperatives, and the sort of more social side of things.
Well, thank you all very much again. And a word to our members that the next discussion that we're having is going to be with the Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper White, who will be sharing with us from her book, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism. So we do hope you'll join us for that. And that's going to be on Tuesday, September 13th at 7 Eastern. And then finally, Pamela, I invite you to close us out with a prayer. You're still muted, Pam.
My apologies. Let us pray. Gracious One, thank you for making us one body with various gifts and abilities. Thank you especially for our siblings, Rachel, Joel, Sandy, and Lauren, who have shared their expertise with us to equip us for ministry in our own settings. Now send us out uplifted in spirit and better prepared for the work ahead. We ask, as always, in the power of your love. Amen.